thank you so much for participating in this and for joining this session. So as Qhala, so we have different arms. So we have Qhala Trust, that is the nonprofit arm of Qhala. And under Qhala Trust, we're able to conduct masterclasses for policymakers between 2025 and 2026. And particularly for this session, we're going to look at the masterclasses we conducted across Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. And we're able to design a curriculum that was able to guide policymakers on how to go about AI policy and AI governance. And it was designed to demystify what AI actually is and to address critical knowledge gaps among senior government officials, regulators, and public sector leaders. And that's the aim of the AI 101 masterclasses for policymakers. So for this, they were delivered in partnership with regional stakeholders. For example, in Nigeria, we did this in partnership with the Data Science Nigeria. In South Africa, we did this in partnership with the DCDT. And we've done these collaborations across the different countries that we've conducted the masterclasses in. So we typically have between 30 to 60 policymakers in the room per program, but there have been some masterclasses where we've had more participants. So with that, we were able to come up with 4 policy briefs. So we did have the reports for each country, that's Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. And in addition to the country reports, we do have 2 policy briefs and 2 advocacy briefs, which are the basis of this session. And the first policy brief was titled, or is titled, Ethical AI Governance for African Policymakers, a Strategic Framework for Sovereignty, Risk Mitigation, and Value for Money. And this brief actually outlines 3 strategic pillars for regional AI policy, emphasizing the urgent need for risk mitigation against systemic harms such as algorithmic bias and AI colonialism, where African data and labor are extracted without equitable return. So it also provides for strategies that ensure that public investments deliver tangible socioeconomic returns and value for money. And that's the basis of that policy brief. The second policy brief is titled Implementing AI Literacy Programs for Policymakers. And these are now the practical guidelines that are based on the actual insights of the masterclass. And the document provides actionable guidelines that's on structuring capability development for government officials. And it highlights that participatory and experiential learning methods are significantly more effective than technical and jargon-heavy lectures for adult policymakers. So the simpler you make it, the more practical you make it, the better for the policymakers. That was the essence of this brief. And it also recommends that it's important to institutionalize AI training within existing civil service academies and develop these curricula through multi-stakeholder partnerships between governments, academia, and technology experts. Now we get into the advocacy briefs. We have the Inclusive AI Governance, a framework for African public servants. This advocacy brief advances a rights-based governance framework designed to mitigate digital exclusion and ensure that AI deployment equitably benefits all segments of society, particularly marginalized communities. And it also focuses on integrating local realities into technology oversights and addressing profound ethical risks like privacy violations, surveillance misuse, and labor market disruptions. The last brief, which is also an advocacy brief, is on AI literacy as an imperative for African public service transformation. And this brief makes the case that AI literacy must not be treated as a peripheral training exercise, but as a core professional competency skill that is crucial for state capability and modernization. It also demonstrates how an AI-literate public sector is better equipped to identify high-impact service use cases and redesign administrative workflows for the national economy for different countries. So those are the overviews or the highlights of what each brief was talking about, and they were developed by the policy team at Qhala. And now I will get into the distinguished panelists who have graciously joined and been part of this webinar. So we start with Dr. Osasuyi Dirisu, who is the Executive Director of the Policy Innovation Center and the Senior Fellow of the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, where she oversees behavioral and policy interventions in health. governance, gender, and social inclusion in Nigeria. And she also holds MBBS degree from the University of Ibadan, and also a master's in public health from the University of Lagos, and an MBA from the Pan-Atlantic University, and a PhD from the University of Leeds. She's also an alumnus of the Harvard Kennedy School and the Blavatnik School of Government, University of Oxford. Dr. Osasuyi is a widely sought after speaker and is listed as one of the top 100 career women in Africa. Welcome, Dr. Osasuyi.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Thank you so much. So our next panelist is Dr. Sandra Makumbirofa. Dr. Sandra is a senior researcher at RIA, which is known as the Research ICT Africa, based in South Africa. And it is a digital policy tank based in Cape Town, South Africa. And she has 12 years of experience in research initiatives across Africa on diverse topics, including AI governance, digital policy, digital trade, industrial policy, and sustainable resource management. And at RIA, she leads research on economic policy for AI, Just AI Fellowship, the Just AI Fellowship Program, digital trade, and mobile data pricing. Welcome, Dr. Sandra.
Thank you, Doreen. Thank you for having me on this panel.
Thank you, Dr. Sandra. And our next panelist is Lyndcey Oriko, who is a lawyer, peace builder, and senior program officer at the Kenya National Cohesion and Integration Commission. And she's passionate about building bridges between people, policy, and technology. And she works to advance social cohesion, human rights, and inclusive civic participation in an evolving digital landscape. She's a natural convener, and Lyndcey brings together diverse voices to spark meaningful dialogue and collaborative solutions. Her work spans digital inclusion, media and information literacy, online safety, and countering harmful online content, with a strong focus on ensuring technology strengthens communities rather than divides them. And she believes that lasting peace is built through informed engagement, responsible innovation, and partnerships that place people at the center of progress. Welcome, Lyndcey.
Thanks, Doreen. I'm excited to be part of this conversation.
Thank you, Lyndcey. So now we'll get right into the panel session, and it will be divided into different sections. So we have the first one. The first portion of this webinar will be the foundation and the framework, where we'll talk about the different briefs. And then the second session will be a deep dive and a cross interaction of the different frameworks or the different briefs. So we'll start with you, Dr. Osasuyi. When we look at brief number 4, which talks about AI literacy and public service transformation, it argues that AI literacy is an absolute imperative for modernizing the African public service. From an innovation perspective and from your experience, what happens when public institutions lack this literacy? And how can AI act as a catalyst for greater state capability and efficiency?
Thank you so much. 2 questions in one. So what happens when public institutions lack this AI literacy? And first of all, we know that in the global south, we are playing, we've seen a lot of advancements in the AI ecosystem, in the startup ecosystem, young people doing a lot of innovative things, both on the continent and globally. We want our public institutions to also catch up because there's that sort of interaction that happens between the public and the private sector. So to ensure that the public sector does not miss opportunities for real public value creation, that is important for the public sector not to continuously play catch up. So moving from sort of our analog manual systems, there are a lot of governance challenges that can just be solved by having our public institutions catch up with AI literacy. I mean, just think about, I'm speaking from one of our experiences with supporting a state to do some digital transformation work some years ago, where, just really looking at the diagnostic phase, we looked at different sectors. So you look at a lot of service delivery bottlenecks, very simple issues relating to, for example, documentation of land assets, that an issue, detecting fraud, just even ensuring that your health surveillance system is in place. In Nigeria, for example, we still have resurgence of things like Lassa fever. Currently, we have an Ebola outbreak in Congo. Think about, the sort of missed value for states or countries to quickly adopt a surveillance system that creates that opportunity for governments to respond. Think about informal economy. 70% of our women, across Africa are, locked into the informal economy. Think about how much opportunities will be missed if the public sector is not able to deliver value, providing in terms of agricultural support, social protection, and the rest. So I think one big thing for us is, at this point, the public sector cannot play catch up. The public sector must be able to support the growing ecosystem of innovation across Africa. But also, this would also impact on the capacity to innovate for policy and creating that enabling environment. So if government does not understand how AI is evolving, then government cannot regulate. So it's also important, for example, to be able to manage that risk of, having those continuous debates or pulling back to say, we don't want AI to cause more harm. Then the government, the public sector needs to understand that better, regulate better, ensure that issues relating to misinformation, just being able to just bridge that gap with regulation and governance, and being that umpire for ethics. And I think the last point, just thinking about that, is also the issue of that sort of dichotomy between state and society. So you have a situation where already, capability gaps. I remember in that state we supported, one of the things we're trying to do was also to modernize the public sector workforce. And we had conversations about attracting young people. And a lot of young people said, oh no, I can't survive in a government office if it's not digitized, because fast-paced thinking, you can't come to an office and start working with paper files. So also, to ensure that we are bridging that capability gap between state and society, is also important for the public sector to play catch up with, not just taking up literacy, digital literacy, but also AI literacy. And then when we start to think about what sort of capabilities will be strengthened in that process, just think about what that does for decision making. One of the biggest things I've always spotlighted as an issue we have with public sector in Africa is really that opportunity to collect administrative data at source to ensure that we have a lot more data for decision making. That is something that AI can enable. And policymakers are able to analyze large volumes of data, either health data, agricultural data, education data. You know where to spotlight for health interventions, for out of school, who is out of school, who do we need to target better. So just speaking to that spectrum around operational efficiency, making better decisions, enhancing service delivery across different sectors. And then finally, just strengthening the capability of government to govern its citizens effectively. So there's so much value for not just digitizing public sector, but also layering AI literacy and strengthening real capabilities for the government to support the wider ecosystem of private sector, development sector much better.
Thank you so much, Dr. Osasuyi. And even as we continue with this conversation, I'd like to continue to welcome all the attendees and the participants who have joined the call. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat feature, and we will address them or point them to the relevant panelists. Thank you so much for your insights, Dr. Osasuyi. And now I'd like to take us to Dr. Sandra. So looking at brief 2, we know that traditional lecture-based training isn't enough. And from a research and continental perspective, and from your experience at RIA, how should governments implement these literacy programs to ensure policymakers truly grasp concepts like algorithmic bias and data governance?
Thanks, Doreen. So I'd actually like to pick up from where Dr. Osasuyi left off, from the responsibility of the government to create an enabling environment. So when we think about AI literacy, I think about it not only as a training problem, but as a governance problem that we have on the continent. When we hear AI literacy, we often imagine civil servants learning about how AI works and how to write better prompts with generative AI. But what we've found from our research at Research ICT Africa is that the real challenge is beyond policymakers understanding the technology, and it is about their capability in governing it. So, for example, we developed a Just AI framework of inquiry at RIA, where we emphasize good AI governance begins with questions rather than answers. So, too often governments ask questions like, should we adopt AI? But the framework encourages policymakers to begin asking questions like, what public problem are we trying to solve with AI? Who will benefit from this solution? And who will bear the risk? Who creates the value? Who is excluded from this value creation? And what assumptions are embedded in the data? Who remains accountable when automated decisions affect African people's lives? So those questions sit at the heart of the framework. We have 9 core inquiries which span human rights, democratic governance, economic justice, data justice, structural inequality, and environmental sustainability. So another central finding from our research is that AI is simply not another digital technology. It is a system of economic production where, if we think of it as it is produced by 3 fundamental factors, which is capital, data, the AI technology itself, and labor. But then these factors don't automatically generate development. So whether AI delivers productivity, growth, employment, and equity depends on how the governments govern them. These 3 factors through appropriate institutional arrangements. So first, if we look at institutional arrangements and market development, governments can establish the rules that shape AI markets through data governance, competition policy, trade policy, intellectual property, privacy, liability, and digital infrastructure. These policies determine whether AI markets become competitive and innovative, or whether they simply reinforce the dominance of a handful of the global technology firms in the global north. And then, second, if we look at state formation, we find that AI is not only transforming AI markets, but it's also transforming the state itself. Governments increasingly rely on AI for public administration, healthcare, taxation, education, and service delivery. So I think it's important that policymakers are capacitated to ensure that AI strengthens institutional capability, democratic accountability, and public trust rather than weakening these. And then, thirdly, if we look at resource mobilization and allocation in our African countries, we find that AI technologies change how governments generate and distribute public resources. So it's important that policymakers understand how AI can improve tax administration, but also how the value that is created from African data is taxed, how this value is redistributed and reinvested into education, into skills development, and into social protection. So without this understanding, AI risks becoming another mechanism for extracting value from the continent rather than creating it. AI is also reshaping all sectors of an economy. You know, it's reshaping finance, taxation, education, healthcare, agriculture, labor markets, procurement. So the implication is that the AI literacy that is given cannot be confined only to the immediate ICT ministries. The literacy programs should deliberately bring together all different types of sectors we have in different African economies. The objective is not to simply build individual expertise, but to build institutional and coordinated across the different governments. so that they're capable of governing AI as a whole of the government rather than a narrow technology issue. So I think, to wrap up my points, I think we also need to think about how we measure the success of the AI literacy programs, not only in how many civil servants complete the courses or how many get the certificate, but also whether the governments consistently make better public decisions after they've acquired these set of skills. Can procurement committees evaluate AI beyond price and functionality? Can regulators anticipate the unintended consequences of the AI technologies they're using in their service delivery? Can ministries identify where AI creates value and where it extracts value? Can governments balance innovation with the public interest? I think for me, the ambition of the Just AI framework of inquiry is that it also assists governments beyond compliance with ethical principles towards developing the institutional judgment that is required to govern AI in ways that strengthen democratic institutions, ways that create public value, promote economic justice, and ensure that AI contributes to equitable development. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sandra. And now, just based on what you've just said, I'd like to take us to Lyndcey. Lyndcey, we're now bringing this to the Kenyan context. We've seen it from the South African and the Nigerian context based on Dr. Osasuyi's experience under the Policy Innovation Center and Dr. Sandra's experience under the Research ICT Africa RIA. And now to the Kenyan perspective or the Kenyan lens and the work that you do at NCIC. How does building capacity within the civil service help us identify meaningful AI use cases that actually serve citizens rather than just adopting technology for technology's sake?
Thank you so much, Doreen. First of all, I want to say that AI literacy is not about turning public servants into AI gurus or experts. So Sandra mentioned a few questions which are very important to equip decision makers to better adopt AI. There are things they have to look at before that. And these questions are like, is it a real public problem? Is it fair? Is it safe? Who benefits? Who might be left behind? So those are very important questions to consider before even thinking about adopting AI in government institutions. Also in Kenya, we've seen that technology works best when it responds to real societal needs. At NCIC, our work focuses on preventing conflicts, promoting inclusion, strengthening social cohesion, but also you find that AI actually help us to detect risks, analyze trends, improve public engagement, and strengthen early warning system. But we cannot use these tools and they can't create value if the people that use them don't understand their potential or even their limitations. From the Kenyan AI class that Qhala actually put us through, there are certain things that were reinforced, and we really appreciate that. You find like we learned that as policymakers, we are not supposed to move. We are supposed to move beyond the excitement of new technologies, the hype and all that. And the shift has to be to evidence-based decision making. How we can enable governance, for example, to adopt AI to improve public services, delivery, how we can avoid solutions that are expensive, unnecessary, and disconnected from the citizens' realities. So I think all in all, or ultimately, the success is not to be measured by the technologies that AI technologies that government adopt or that the government think they need, but it's whether citizens experience better, fairer, and more trusted public services.
Thank you so much, Lyndcey. That was straight to the point. And now, just for the sake of the participants, so far we've covered the foundation of AI literacy and public service transformation from the lens of Nigeria, South Africa, and Kenya. And now we're going to do a deep dive into the actual frameworks, thinking about ethical, inclusive, and sovereign governance from the lens of protecting citizens, Ubuntu, and digital sovereignty. And now I'll take us back to Dr. Sandra. Brief one outlines a strategic framework for AI sovereignty and risk mitigation, with 90% of global compute power concentrated outside of Africa. How can African policymakers combat this AI colonialism and ensure that our data and infrastructure serve our economic growth?
Okay, thank you. So I think the first step is in recognizing that AI colonialism is about where AI is built and where computer is located. It's about where the value is created. Like I said before, who captures that value and who has the power to shape the rules of governing AI. So we can see throughout history, colonial economies exported raw materials and imported higher value finished products back to Africa. Today, there is a risk that we reproduce the same pattern, right, in the digital economy. Our continent increasingly exports data, African data, most recently our languages, our cultural knowledge, creative content, and particularly our digital labor, while importing increasingly sophisticated AI models, cloud services, and digital platforms that are developed in the North. So the resource has changed, from minerals to now data and our labor. But the political economy of this extraction remains quite similar to what has been happening. Our research argues that understanding AI colonialism requires us to think about the entire AI production system. So, like I said before, if we look at the strategic assets of AI, capital, data, labor, compute, intellectual property, and the institutional capability, Africa already contributes significantly in many of these inputs. However, through our minerals, for example, which power global semiconductor supply chains, our workers who are contributing to data annotation and content moderation from the continent are African citizens who are generating valuable data sets every day. Yet the continent captures only very small proportion of the value created from these inputs, from these resources. So if we look at that kind of asymmetry, not simply the fact that the technology originates elsewhere, but also just the fact that we are getting very small proportion of that value. It's a real policy challenge that we want to address in African countries. So the question for governments is not simply how to consume more AI effectively, but how to participate more meaningfully in creating and governing AI value chains. So I think we need to rethink what we mean by digital sovereignty. Sovereignty shouldn't be confused with technological nationalism or an expectation that every African country must build its own AI model. We already know there is very stiff competition from the North. We lack a lot of resources, especially the foundational resources that is required to build these technologies. We're talking about electricity, access to digital technologies, access to the internet itself from the country. So we're not talking about every African country trying to build its own AI model, but looking at sovereignty in terms of institutional capability. So this would be ensuring that governments retain meaningful choices over AI, how it's developed, deployed, and governed within their government jurisdictions, within their countries. So this means having the capacity to decide how our local data is governed, how it is used, how markets remain competitive, how public procurement stimulates the local pockets of innovation that we have in the African countries, how intellectual property is managed. So this means updating our intellectual property policies that we have in the different countries, how taxation captures this value from the AI-enabled economic activity, and also how AI contributes to national development priorities. So sovereignty for African countries should be the ability to shape these outcomes rather than just adapting to decisions that are made elsewhere. We have our research, like our AI and economic policy research, which also highlights that data should be understood not simply as a resource to be protected, but as a developmental infrastructure. So too often in discussions, we talk about data governance focusing exclusively on privacy, on personal data privacy. And though privacy is very essential, it is only one part of the picture. So governments should also ask how data creates public value, especially public non-personal data that the different governments hold in their data depositories. So across Africa, governments often lack the high quality public data sets that are required for evidence-based policymaking. And at the same time, global firms continue to derive enormous commercial value from African data ecosystems. So the challenge is therefore to develop governance frameworks that simultaneously protect rights while enabling responsible access to data for public interest research, enabling access of African language data for African language models, for local entrepreneurship and innovation. We have the AU, the African Union Data Policy Framework, which progressively emphasizes that we should give preferential access of our African data to African innovators and businesses. Give them first preference to our data before the global north gets access to that data, so that data governance should not only prevent harm, but then it should also actively support African value creation. Looking back also on our Just AI framework, which argues that we must move beyond the language of ethical AI to responsible AI. I think those principles are important because they're not sufficient. But they're not sufficient. An AI system can be transparent, accountable, and technically fair, but at the same time, it can still produce unjust outcomes if it reinforces the structural inequalities or enables the continued extraction of value from African societies. So when we speak about AI justice, we want justice to require us to ask different questions, such as, does AI expand opportunities for those who have historically been excluded? Does it strengthen democratic governance? Does AI create public value rather than concentrating private value? And does it improve economic inclusion? Also questions like, does it contribute to environmental sustainability? Does it help repair rather than reproduce the historical inequalities? Those are the kind of questions that distinguish a justice-oriented approach from an ethics-only approach to AI governance. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sandra. That was very wholesome and comprehensive. And with that basis, I'd like to take us to Lyndcey. And Lyndcey, on brief 3, we see that there's an advocation for, or it does advocate for, inclusive AI governance rooted in African values like Ubuntu. Given the ethical risks of AI, such as deepfakes, misinformation, and many other biases, for instance, in facial recognition, how do we build governance frameworks that protect human dignity and social cohesion? I feel like Dr. Sandra kind of already touched on this, but I'm sure you can touch on it from peace building and from your perspective.
Yeah, thank you so much, Doreen. I believe inclusion shouldn't be an afterthought. It has to be like the starting point of the whole process. Ubuntu reminds us that technology should strengthen our shared humanity and values. AI should expand opportunities, not deepen the existing inequalities, or even create more forms of exclusion. So this means that governance frameworks must be rights-based, transparent, and also accountable. They should ensure that AI systems are tested for bias, are localized, especially when it comes to reflecting African languages, the context, the local context, and protecting privacy, which is also very important, and should include meaningful public participation on how these technologies are not just developed, but also deployed. Government institutions like NCIC, for example, AI is very important because it influences public discourse at unprecedented speed. You find like deepfakes that you mentioned, synthetic media, algorithms that amplify misinformation, disinformation, hate speech. They fuel polarization, and all this erode trust in government and also undermine peaceful coexistence in a country. So what can we do? The response, therefore, is collaboration. You know, governments should be able to work with civil society, should be able to work with the social media platforms, should be able to work with academia, should be able to even work with the communities to build resilience, to strengthen digital literacy, and establish, I think most importantly, to also establish safeguards that protect rights and also support innovation. That issue of government over-regulating or under-regulating, so having that balance is very important. So all in all, I think inclusive AI governance is therefore just ensuring that AI reflects our values, protects our people, and also contributes to stronger and more cohesive societies.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And now, as we even wrap up this segment on the ethical aspects or the inclusive aspects or even sovereignty governance, I'd like to take us to Dr. Osasuyi. So a key part of ethical governance is value for money. How can governments design inclusive AI policies that protect citizens, but still encourage a thriving and innovative local AI market without over-regulating?
Thank you so much. And this is a very, very important question because we see what strict regulation does in terms of crippling innovation, shutting out investments, you know, and almost you can shut out an entire industry with that. So one of the reflections I have on this is, first of all, adopting a risk-based approach. So how do we protect citizens in a way that we are not creating so much compliance burdens for startups and innovators, where people are now running helter-skelter trying to meet up with standards rather than thinking outside the box. And then looking at, you know, for example, I'm developing a simple business tool, putting that on one end of the risk spectrum compared to, for example, a high-risk healthcare diagnostic application. So I think that's one way to look at it. Another way is just to reflect on why don't we all co-create this together? So let's have regulatory sandboxes where you know, we're testing under regulatory supervision, and everyone has the opportunity, including governments, to learn, adapt, and then people understand what full-scale deployment means. But also thinking about the principles. One of the things we've learned in our policy work is to embed policy testing into our processes in supporting government. So we have we've done a lot of co-creation, we've developed a policy framework. Can we have 4 or 5 iterations of this and then actually do some real life testing, and then see what sort of challenges are coming out of it, and then can go back with government and reiterate. What that has done is it gives people that confidence that the policies and regulations are not coming as punitive measures, but government is actually open to co-creating what works, and then ensuring that in publishing these standards, there's fairness, there's accountability, taking into consideration what is inclusive for vulnerable groups, So the entire spectrum of just creating proper standards for regulating an industry has been taken into place. But we're not thinking about it as something that comes from crippling an ecosystem. We've put the minimum safeguards in place. There's clear accountability, but then there are also opportunities for co-creation, and also creating that opportunity for revalidation, co-creation, and going back and forth, and really creating those opportunities to support the local ecosystems. One other thing that I think is really important when we think about value for money is, what does the local ecosystem need? Yes, they need regulation, but what else do they need? They need funding, they need incentives, they need incubation hubs, they need opportunities for data sets. Can we have open? So government looking at the whole spectrum of regulation beyond the standards and the policies, but looking at the bigger enabling environment and working with the ecosystem to create what is needed to innovate, but at the same time, what is also needed to co-create what the standards should look like. And I think one of the things I would like to finally talk about is, thankfully, we're moving, especially with the way we're advancing in the AI ecosystem. We are now seeing the need for our local standards to evolve based on African realities and not just copying and pasting from what we see working in the global north. And what that helps us to do is, we are not bringing untested regulations, because one other thing that happens with regulation is, bring this policy, bring these standards, dump them onto the innovation ecosystem. But also by looking at the local realities, looking at what works within our limited resources, what works within our digital access gaps, what works for the informal economies, what works for our digital language diversity, for example, what will create more jobs, So there's that sort of iterative opportunity to think about what is fit for purpose for Africa. And so in building this regulatory ecosystem, the innovator, the startups feel supported, they feel encouraged, to know that their government is for us. And government is working hand in hand with us to ensure that regulation is creating pathways for innovation and not creating restrictions that would now limit us from innovating. And that's when you hear local startups talking about going to hosts, outside the continent, which of course is not beneficial to us. So I think there's quite a lot that can be done in thinking about how does our regulatory environment improve access to markets, such that compliance becomes an enabler and not a barrier to entry for innovation and startups.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And you've really just taken us through the next section that we're going to talk about. But I really like what you said about the way regulation should be a pathway to innovation rather than a pathway to inhibiting or limiting innovation, so that we can avoid brain drain and all of the external hosting that we see. And even as we go on to the next segment of this webinar, I'd like to encourage all the participants to continue writing their questions in the chat. And we will definitely take up the questions during the Q&A session, which is immediately after this one. So write as much as you can, and the panelists here will definitely answer your questions accordingly. So just on to what Dr. Osasuyi just mentioned on innovation and regulation. During the masterclasses, we had a section or a session in one of the modules where we had a debate between innovation and regulation. And now I'm going to take this question now back to you panelists, Dr. Osasuyi, Dr. Sandra, and Lyndcey. that tension between innovation and regulation, those who want minimal regulation and those who want strict rules. That was the tension that we saw playing out in the different countries. What is one immediate practical step an African government can take tomorrow or even in the next few years or the next few months to find that middle ground? I'd like Lyndcey to start, and then Dr. Sandra, then we'll conclude with Dr. Osasuyi.
Thank you. I think that's an interesting question because it's something that governments grapple with quite a lot when they're making their policy decisions, whether to focus more on innovation or to focus more on regulation. In the free market economy, we encourage things to be left to the market to regulate themselves. However, what we usually find, especially in our African governments, is that there is need for some regulation because not everything is equal. People don't have the equal resources. So you have to make sure that, the state has to make sure that resources are allocated fairly according to need and according to the different budgets that they have from their resource mobilization. So I think the first step one of the things that African governments need to do when looking at AI and whether to innovate or to regulate it more is to ask the important questions of saying, yes, we want to encourage innovation for economic development and to increase employment and all the different development is affected by these innovative policies that we are putting across. Who stands to gain? What risks are there? And how can we mitigate them? I think that's the first question that they should ask themselves when they are thinking of the two and how to balance it. Thank you.
Yeah, I totally agree. We have to, or the government has to think about all those important questions before coming up with hard and fast rules or coming up with very soft law that will destabilize things. So there has to be that fine balance. And now I'd like us to hear from Dr. Osasuyi. Do you have any, you had already alluded to this when you were speaking, but I'm sure you have more points on this. And then you can even chime into what Dr. Sandra already mentioned. So feel free, take it away.
Thank you so much. I would right on what Dr. Sandra had started to talk about. Let me introduce a perspective that this is one question that would have a delicate balance across the continent. It will not be a one size fits all, and that will be because we are at different stages in our journey. Some countries may be at a stage where they need more, maybe a bit more like safeguarding as a result of some things that have happened in the journey to building regulatory environment. Some others may need to really open a lot more for innovation. So I think it's that delicate balance that really requires governments to first create an evidence-based approach, almost like an evidence-based approach to iterate and learn. So you create an innovative environment. Why do you want to do that? Because you want to see faster products. You want to ensure that early stage companies don't feel crippled. And then in doing that, you're also looking at what do I need to do to ensure that there's some oversight, especially for applications that will be high impact, have security risks, have implications across geographies. The sandbox is one thing that could help again, but I think also it's really data, really having the data that speaks to what we're learning as we're adapting. So for example, if I don't know how well across the continent we're documenting our AI journeys. So just from documenting how the ecosystems are evolving, can also help government take a decision on, for example, if you prioritize innovation in one sector, and some of these things could also be sector specific. So if you prioritize innovation in one sector, that doesn't mean there's no regulation there, to give some time to see what can, come out. Based on what data is saying, you can come back and say, you know what, based on some of the things we have learned, we need to come back and put in opportunities for this. Another way to do this is to build a pilot layer such that you are not limiting that innovation period, but you're creating a layer that allows people to pilot in a safe space where you have some controlled opportunity to put a stop to what's not going to work and enable what will work. So I think that this will be something that will be highly context specific, but also that delicate balance between innovation and safeguarding, because at the end of the day, we want AI to work for good and to solve real.
Exactly. So as Dr. Sandra said, ask those important questions. As Dr. Osasuyi has said, that delicate balance needs to be there based on evidence-based research and having regulatory sandboxes and regulatory pilots so that we can have that testing that is very nuanced to each country, because we know the realities for each African country are very different. And now, Lyndcey, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, sorry about earlier on. I lost my connection. I think my fellow panelists have covered almost everything, but then I think one of the most important things that comes out, and I highly support, is when it comes to the balance in regulation and also supporting local new innovation where we have like the sandboxes and all that. That's really important because we keep talking about localizing, but then how are we going to localize if we are not encouraging, local innovation? Also, my other opinion, or I think based on my work, is having the citizens or the human aspects, like looking at this thing with a human rights lens when AI or technology is being developed, like ensuring that the end user is safe, that safety by design, having safety by design included in the development and all that. I also think like when it comes to the digital divide, we may talk about AI and all that, but we don't have the infrastructure. We've mentioned about people who are in areas they can't even connect to the internet and all that. So I think that's also something that's very important for our country, to ensure that our infrastructure are inclusive and connection is people can access these technologies. So I also think, as we said, sometimes we say we want our localized innovation and all that, but I think also we can develop AI in ways that are contextual for us, but also we can align them with international best practices just to give them some weight and move with the world globally. So yeah, that's all I have.
Thank you so much, Lyndcey. I think that's also quite informative. And now we're going to go into the Q&A session of this webinar. Just based on everything that we've said, please, as participants, please feel free to continue writing your questions. So the first question, I'll direct this to Dr. Sandra. It's from Mbangi. And Mbangi says, we talk a lot about building the AI capacity of policymakers and public servants, but I want to ask a slightly different question. Where are the ministries and departments themselves in this conversation? Because it's one thing to have individuals who are AI capable, but what happens when those individuals return to their institutions or their government departments that may not have, they're not ready to take up the capacity that we've built for these policymakers? Are we focusing too much on building AI-capable people without asking whether the institutions they work in are also actually AI ready?
Thank you. That's a very good question, especially for the African continent, where we find ourselves limited in terms of resources and capacity in the different jurisdictions where we come from. So, yes, in as much as we want to equip the government, the civil servants with upskilling in terms of knowing about AI and how to use them to create an enabling environment. What's also important is that context-specific tailor-making of these programs. So, for example, whether you are offering these upskilling opportunities to local governments in rural areas or working in least resourced places in African countries, I think it is up to the people who are giving these training to be able to understand the local context where these governments are in. So once we understand where they are operating in, how resourced they are, the limitations they have in terms of capacities, abilities, and resources, then we are able to tailor make a program that is more useful for them, right? And also, I think the second thing we need to do is to encourage a participatory approach in the training programs where we allow the different civil servants who are taking them to speak about their jurisdictions, what kind of problems they're facing, what kind of challenges they're finding in their own capacities. So whether these challenges are access to internet, the basic access to foundational services like Lyndcey just spoke about, we need to understand those first before we apply the different methods we want to use to educate them, to assist them in enabling that AI environment that we want for our economies. I think it's an important point that has been raised, and I think the solution lies in firstly understanding the audience we are giving this AI literacy to, and then adapting our training program for that particular audience to make sure that at the end of the day it is relevant and useful in their jurisdictions when they go back to try to apply some of these methods that we would have taught them in. It is more applicable and relevant for their context and they can actually use them. Yeah,
I totally agree. And just going back to what Lyndcey had said on mitigating or even solving those infrastructural challenges before we start to think about AI and data governance, I think if we can solve, for example, the electricity crisis that we face across the continent, or even basic connection to digital devices, I think then we can start to scale those solutions even as we lead up to having very nuanced AI governance relating to our different stages in terms of the different countries. Thank you so much. And now I'd take this question to Dr. Osasuyi. This is from, forgive me if I'm butchering your name, so Chiemezie asks, what are the effective strategies to raise awareness of generative AI in rural communities in Nigeria, for instance, without raising fears about the use of technology?
Thank you, and really good question. I think it was a question we answered last week, looking at some of our partners deploying some AI solutions in rural areas, especially in the area of access to health services. So one of the things we're learning with raising the awareness is to focus more, first of all, to think about the fact that we don't want to create information overload. So focusing on the benefits, so not on the technology, so not focusing on the big ticket things that technology can do, but for a farmer, so this is what we're going to do, and you need to understand a bit more about your pricing, weather forecast. So focusing on the benefits as opposed to the technologies, one thing I think can really help. So for health workers or for patients, this is what it's going to do for providing maternal care guidance. So that way they begin to see that technology can help solve some basic everyday problems that they have. And in terms of gaining entry, we have to use very trusted community intermediaries. And I mean, in Nigeria, a lot of work has been done with community leaders, religious leaders. We're increasingly using women's groups and women's cooperatives to also provide this information. And I think one last thing that is important is also to think about language. So the local language, looking for trusted people within the community, voices or messaging they can recognize, and then taking simple use cases and exemplars that have worked and turning them into the messaging that can now deliver that real value to local communities. But a lot is already going on. And there's a real opportunity to continue to just engage local communities. But I think is a little at a time, focusing on very simple, relatable benefits and ensuring that the process of entering and engaging is very transparent, it's direct, and addresses their fear of being harmed by technology. And then as we do this, we can now begin to layer on opportunities for digital or AI literacy. But we don't start from AI literacy because you completely shut your communities out.
I totally agree. So having that multi-stakeholder approach where you understand where different communities are and how they view certain things, I think is also very important in scaling AI across the continent and even across our countries and the different communities within our countries. Thank you so much for that. Now I'd like to ask Lyndcey, the same participant has asked a question. With the growing improvement of generative AI platforms in creating real-time and believable content, can governance help mitigate how AI content is used, especially in terms of scams?
This is a very complicated question because technology is getting so sophisticated and at times catching up is difficult. But I know some of the things that we do in the course of our work is, for example, like platform accountability, asking them to take down whatever content is there. There's also the issue of establishing accountability frameworks, the different actors or irresponsible for that issue, like what can they do about it? Technical guardrails, human loops. Sometimes you find these things, people think they're humans. They're machines, they're AI machines that are pushing forward these things. So there's also that need of having the human moderation apart from just looking at these issues as, okay, let's use AI to fix AI, Also legal deterrence. There's penalizing fraud. There's promoting public awareness, which I think is very important because we also realize there's one thing that came up some time back that you find, let me use the borrowing, the mediums, you find where people take loans and all that. So you do not read the policy or whatever is there before you apply for it, So later on, things happen and you wonder, what happened? I didn't see it. So I think also public awareness is very important for the public to know, and before you engage in anything. And also protecting yourself when it comes to digital hygiene, because most of these things you find, like you go to a cyber cafe, you forget to log out, someone gets into your computer and all that, you leave data protection, you leave your ID somewhere else, people are able to access your phone numbers, and frauds are also, it makes it very easy for frauds to access your personal information and all that. So I think also public awareness is very important. And just ensuring that you use your digital, you use your digital equipment safely, and also you understand where to report, how to report, and also the institutions that are actually connected to such things. So if it's something with mobile phones, or if it's your M-Pesa and all that, you can reach out to Safaricom, to help you follow up, etc.
Yes, I totally agree. I think there's a place for regulations, the laws and the statutes, and even the institutions that have been put in place. For instance, in Kenya, the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner, and all of these regulations that we have to mitigate the adverse effects of misuse of data. But then there's also a place for personal awareness. So there needs to be that balance between the rules and the regulations and the institutions that have been put in place to enable safeguarding of the rights of the citizens generally, or anyone within the country. But then even as individuals, we need to take up cyber hygiene or digital hygiene, as Lyndcey said, just making us personally aware of what deepfake looks like, and what is actually true, what is misinformation, what is disinformation, so that we can be very tech savvy in our own rights. So I think there's definitely need for that balance. Now I'd like to ask the last question, but it's still open. This is the last question I can see, but then there's still space for more questions to be asked. So, and yes, Mbangi, we will share the recording upon completion of the webinar. So this is from Sadiq Shah. This question is open for all the panelists to take. So Sadiq writes, Africa does not rely on its own data to feed AI. With only 1% of local data available and reliance on data is from the West, what steps can be made to consolidate data capture from African countries? Any of the panelists can take this.
I think research. Yeah. Combining our research or working together as African countries, doing research on the topic itself, and then now coming up with like a conclusive document. Yeah. Any of my colleagues can add something.
Yes, I also agree with Lyndcey that research also plays a very important part, because that's where you get the evidence from the ground, especially evidence that comes from the questions that you're seeing, the data gaps that are there. In addition to this, one of the biggest hurdles in African countries that we have is a lot of African governments collect data from their citizens, whether it's biometric data, whether it's health data, different types of data that they collect and hold in their data repositories. So with this new technology, AI, I think governments are quite aware of the risks that are there in terms of sharing our African data. And in fact, even before AI, in most African countries, this data is not readily available for the public to access and use because of the different country sovereignty policies that they have. The state still wants to have control over their data. So it's quite difficult then to have this data, number one, standardized in good quality format that it can be used to input into AI technologies. So then that's the reason why we have the problem that we have, only having this 1% data from African countries. I think countries in the north are quite good at disseminating their data and making it available for public use. This, encourages innovation, because, if you can go to a website and download the data, you can do lots of things. I believe in African countries, we could really gain from having this data available for the public to use, for our innovation, for our researchers to use. So I think some of the efforts that research institutions and civil society organizations on the continent are trying to do is to encourage the government to share their non-personal data that they hold in their data repositories, so that African innovators can use this data to innovate. And like I said before, preferential access to this data would also be useful for Africans first, before it is disseminated to the wider public outside the African continent. I think it would really allow us as a continent to be able to come up with innovative solutions to the problems that we have, because these are problems that we experienced, our lived experience, and I think we're also best to be able to come up with solutions to solve them. But if we don't have access to the data, then, the AI technologies that we're using are not exactly context specific. They're not as useful as they would be if our data was also embedded in the technologies that we're producing. Yeah.
I totally agree with that. I see Dr. Osasuyi is itching to say something, so you can just go ahead.
I'm not going to say anything different, so I'm just going to add a new perspective. I think, thank you so much for what you have said. I think my joy is that everybody is talking about this problem. So the fact that we have a collective understanding that this is a problem, I think is good. So I'm just putting it out here that as we all have that shared understanding, there has to be a lot more advocacy in country, across the continent, to see that shared responsibility to make this happen. Like Dr. Sandra has said, collecting data. Earlier, I talked about administrative data that, Africa, we collect inconsistently sometimes, but at least we have. So beginning to support our local institutions to clean up data and begin, just making progress. I literally, whenever I think about this, I think about it in terms of, can we have a roadmap to moving from 1% to 20%? A 20-year vision, a 15-year vision. So, but in order to achieve this, I think a lot more advocacy. So like we're having the conversation here, is going into policy briefs, is going into bigger conversations in summits and conferences across the continent. And there's a lot more call for action. I'm trusting that hopefully in the next few years, we see a lot more investments and conversations that really translate to action in Africa, taking ownership for its own data repositories.
Well said. I couldn't say it better. Thank you so much, Lyndcey. Thank you so much, Sandra. Thank you so much, Osasuyi. I'd like to take a question from Motsao. I hope I've said your name well. I've seen your hand is raised. You can, if you're in a position to, you can unmute and speak. Motsao, I'm not sure if you're able to, if that's been enabled. If not, please type your question in the chat and we'll take it. Okay, so even as we wait on that, we can take one final round of questions, if any. If none, in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. If there are no more questions, I'd like to ask the panelists to give their final round of contributions or final remarks based on their line of work and even the briefs that were shared with them and what we've discussed today. We will start with Dr. Osasuyi. Then we will go to Sandra and then Lyndcey.
And thank you so much. It's been a great conversation reflecting on just the sort of regulation and innovation ecosystem across Africa and the role that public institutions play. I would like to just end by saying that it would be great to see our public institutions, play a more active role in driving and supporting and creating that enabling environment for Africa to take the lead in this sort of AI revolution going on across the world. We don't want to be left behind, but we also know that our public institutions have a very important role to play. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Osasuyi. Sandra?
Thank you, Doreen. I think for me, I want to congratulate you for the initiative that you have in capacitating the different African governments with AI literacy on the continent. I think it is something that we need, and we need to have a lot more governments participating in that. And as a last reflection, I think our greatest strength lies in collective action on the continent. We are 54 African countries, and I think, like my fellow panelists have said, I don't think one African country has the strength to individually compete with the global north by themselves. But through continental cooperation, I think through the African Union, through the different harmonized data governance frameworks that we have on the continent, coordinated policies and shared digital infrastructure and collaborative research, I think we can build larger markets, stronger institutions, and more bargaining power as a collective rather than as individual countries. And this is something that consistently comes out from our research, that fragmented national responses to this will simply reproduce the inequalities that we've had historically. So by acting collectively as African countries, we can shape global AI governance rather than just simply responding to it. Thanks.
Totally agree and resonate with that. And I think Dr. Osasuyi was part of the team we had doing the governance frameworks for India, and it was a concerted effort, as you have mentioned, Dr. Sandra, where we had individuals and organizations from different African countries just coming together to come up with frameworks and solutions for different pillars, be it governance, talent, innovation, compute, research and innovation. So it's very important to have that concerted effort and that multi-country and multi-stakeholder approach towards solving African problems. Lyndcey?
Thank you so much, Doreen, for this conversation. Personally, I've also learned a lot. And I think number one, or the priority is usually collaboration. There's always strength in numbers. When we work together, the impact is wider, it's bigger, it's better. But I also think as Africa shapes its AI future, our greatest or the biggest investment is not only in technology, but in the people and also the institutions that govern these people. So to bring confidence, because I know a lot of people, when it comes to government and governance, a lot of techies or civil society would be like, government is just there to stifle, etc., surveillance and all that. But I think sometimes when this collaboration, first of all, comes in, we get to understand each other, So that is even helpful when now the work is happening, because sometimes you assume that government or people in government, they know what is going on, what's happening, and solutions. But then they also need that support from the civil society, from academia, for research, etc. So I think that's important, and that will give policymakers so much confidence to innovate responsibly, inclusive governance, and also will ensure that innovation advances dignity, equality, public trust. And when we get those things right, I think at the end of the day, AI can be a very powerful tool for development, peace, and social cohesion, not just within Africa, but also beyond.
Thank you so much, Lyndcey. Thank you so much, Dr. Sandra. Thank you so much, Dr. Osasuyi. And thank you to all the participants who've joined the call and who stayed through, and all the questions that were asked. We are officially closing the webinar at this point, unless there are any other questions that might come up at this last minute. Then I had shared the briefs, and they're also available on the Luma link where you registered for this event. If you do have any questions that you'd like to further ask, let me type in the email address that you can send the questions to. Just so the email address that you can send the questions to is policy@qhala.com. Feel free to ask any other questions that you have or might not have been able to ask at this point. And thank you so much for joining. And I hope that we can continue collaborating as we have talked about in this webinar. Thank you so much and have an amazing evening. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Doreen.